Welcome to the Gallian Foundation's webinar on the ethical aspects of digital transformation in healthcare and research. I am Dr. Theodore Search, the CEO of Skipta, Informa Pharma Intelligence, and the creator of Skipta, an award-winning private social network for physicians and medical practitioners with a network of more than 1 million members. As you are aware, this is a very exciting week for the Foundation. In addition to this webinar, Gallian is hosting a series of high-profile events based for the first time in Dakar, Senegal. The program includes the Youth Forum on December 8th, the Women Leaders Forum on December 9th, and the Gallian Forum Africa on December 10th and 11th. These events are an important chance to advance the Gallian Foundation's mission, innovation to improve the human condition, through the open exchange of ideas that drive science and new innovations. Notably, this week, we will have a particular focus on the increasingly important role of Africa in global health, and will culminate with the launch of the inaugural Pre-Gallian Africa Award. For today's webinar, we have assembled a distinguished panel of industry, academic, and regulatory experts to examine how the digital transformation in life sciences will shape the industry's largest single driver of R&D expenditure, the clinical trial. We will discuss how the growing use of advanced applications will influence future trends on trial design, logistics, participation, monitoring and reporting, and most importantly, patient access. Although data science tools promise a higher scale of trial efficiency and cost savings, the landscape of patient privacy, IP protections, and trial diversity and inclusion is still evolving. The reliability of interpretation of progressive trials, observational studies, and collection and use of real-world evidence is also in the mix. This webinar aims to help guide digital transformation toward outcomes that advance research while protecting patients and the integrity of the regulatory process in medicine. The webinar includes some time for audience questions, and I encourage all of you to type any questions that you have in the chat box. I will do my best throughout our session today to address all of your questions. And with that, it is my absolute honor to introduce the panelists that will lead today's timely discussion. And they include Dr. Rachele Berria, Vice President and Medical Head, U.S. Biopharmaceuticals at AstraZeneca, and a key player and pioneer in clinical trial innovations. Ms. Jessica Federer, Managing Director at Huma. She is recognized as one of the top 100 global Chief Digital Officers. Dr. George Mathew, Chief Medical Officer, North America, DXC Technology, and a clinical expert and healthcare thought leader. And also Mr. Srivatsan, Senior Vice President and Chief Digital Officer, R&DS Technology Solutions, who draws on over 30 years of experience in growing business in the digital, data, AI, analytics, IT, and operations management areas. And with that, to our great panelists, thank you so much for your time today and welcome. And to begin, I would like to ask each of our panelists to address a few of the following questions that I will ask. And I will start with Mr. Sri. Sri, for the first question, I'd love your input on. It goes as follows. What are best practices in digital health ethics frameworks overall? Sri, welcome, and thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you very much for this opportunity and a pleasure to be here. As you know, when you start to build AI and algorithms, one needs to really look at how biases get introduced. Biases get introduced in three areas. One is what we call bias in design. Second is bias in data. And the third is bias in selection. Each of them, as we start to introduce biases, you really need to make sure that you have the right protection against those. Because first, if your data does not have a good diversity and inclusion, the models and the outputs, the algorithms will be built, will of course result in erroneous interpretations and would not be able to be viewed in the right manner. Similarly, if you had selection, as in what parameters you're selecting to make a design, that causes further issues. So many regulatory agencies, including the FDA and others, have taken quite a stringent view around how do we go about building algorithms which do not introduce bias. And within the framework, they really talk about three models. One is, what is the data you're using to train the model? So training is very important. So it's called high data quality around training. The second is, as the algorithms start to be built, how do you verify the correctness of the algorithm? And the verification of correctness has to be proved empirically with data and evidence. The third is, how do you use validation or performance testing to ensure that those algorithms are actually performing the way they will have to be done? So as you start to really look at best practices around bias, it goes back to the guidance. How do you, A, police the algorithms? Two, how do you humanize the problem? How do you bring the human in play to really look at the data, the algorithms, and the model of how it is getting built, and to make sure that we have the right sensitivization of that? And three, how do you really bring in the notion of explainability? Because the key part of algorithms is, can you explain the outcome and the output of this? Last but not the least, some best practices which are evolving in such a critical domain like this is the notion of a chief ethics officer, because this one has to be viewed like privacy and like security as a domain which cuts across multiple different functions. So that's, Ted, in my view, some of the best practices one needs to do to make sure that we're building the right algorithms, but also making sure that they are not having biases in them.
Sri, thank you so much for your valuable input. And Ms. Jessica Federer, welcome. Thank you so much for your valuable time today. If I could, I'd love to get your response to the same question. And just as a reminder to you, question is as follows: what are best practices in digital health ethics frameworks overall? Jessica, welcome.
Thank you, Ted. Yeah, this is a question that I think has been at the forefront of mind. I was Chief Digital Officer at Bayer. I was on IRBs in the past. And, we're always trying to ask, similar to Sri's question, how are we ensuring humanity in the technology that is representative? And, Sri talked about the design, the data, the bias in design and data and selection, but it also goes to how are you designing for that humanity piece? And I want to refer to an ethics framework that's a little different, a little non-traditional. It's an article that came out in JAMA from Don Berwick, one of the godfathers in our field, about the moral determinants of health. And, I think we talk a lot about what is required by regulators, what is required by the IRBs, but he takes it a step further and he says, what are the moral determinants? What should be the guidelines? And if we look at the moral determinants, we're going to focus on the social determinants. And so the social determinants don't always filter in to these discussions that are led by regulators and IRBs, but it is our obligation to introduce them into the framework. And then in addition to the working, to look hard about design, data, and selection bias, we're also then looking for a bias in representation and making sure that we are designing our solutions in a way that no one's left out, so that it's device agnostic, that it's geographically accessible, that the data is fed back to our participants in the way that it engenders trust, and that we're closing that feedback loop. And not just having a one-way exchange of information, but using technology to actually make it a two-way exchange of information. And a lot of these best practices are evolving institution by institution. There are some wonderful organizations that are starting to share them, but I think it's time for us to push beyond what an IRB requires or what a standard code tells us to do, and say, what should we strive for in 2020? Where we all have computers in our pockets, what should the moral and ethical standard for digital and clinical trials look like? And how do some of us, being leaders in our space, how do we make it happen? Because it's going to be up to many of us, our companies in this call. We're going to be the ones that have the opportunity to make it a reality. So what does that look like? And how are we involving all the patient groups? How are we involving advocacy organizations? How are we involving the regulators to bring them along to evolve the standards that are being applied?
Jessica, thank you so much for that valuable input. And I'd like to welcome Dr. George Mathew. Dr. Mathew, thank you so much for joining us today. If I could, I have the same question for you, and just as a reminder to yourself and the audience, the question is, what are best practices in digital health ethics frameworks overall? George, welcome and thank you.
Thank you, and thank you for inviting me and letting me participate with this group. I'll try to be equal to the challenge. I'm going to start, though, by shamelessly borrowing from Dr. Srivatsan and Ms. Federer in terms of their answers, because both of them kind of stole my thunder a bit, but in a much more intelligible way. When we talk about best practices for digital health, we have to keep in mind this is a very quickly evolving, see, this is the part I borrowed from you, Dr. Srivatsan, a quickly evolving arena, because where before clinical trials were run in a way where it was very, I would say, parental, or where you had a key group of very intelligent folks that could interpret the data, and then only they could then determine what was going to happen with the distribution of that information. Digital health gives us new opportunities and new ways to potentially run these trials. Also, because of the advances of digital technology in general in our everyday lives, people are very facile. It's very easy for them to use these technologies to accomplish what they need to get done. And they feel empowered to understand what it is they're doing and participating in. So when we look at best practices, many of the best practices for digital health reflect what's traditionally always been done with clinical trials, right? When we look at the NIH or even the Newfield Council on Bioethics, a lot of it is based on, this is how you must administer a trial. These are the things that need to be done so that you do this to respect what we've learned the hard way in the past, be it from World War II, be it from the Tuskegee experiments. These are things that we realize we have to respect our subjects. And there are specific things that are trying to avoid issues like exclusion, trying to make sure that you don't focus on just one ethical or ethnic subgroup, but you try to get as many diverse representations as possible to reflect the group that you want to treat over time. You want to avoid exploitation, because obviously you don't want to take advantage of a group in any way, shape, or form. And then there's omission, if you will, where you don't fully explain the ramifications of what people don't understand what they're signing up for. So when they participate, they realize after the fact what's happened to them or their data. So these are things that are definitely best practices of the past and the present. But I believe in the future, if we look at how digital health technologies can elevate not only science in general, but also the ability for people to choose to participate and understand what they're doing. Quite honestly, the best example I've seen, and again, this is due to one of my colleagues on the panel today, is the San Code of Research, and that was done by an African tribe that was, I would say, hoodwinked a bit into clinical trial research, and then vowed never to do it again, not unless they, as subjects, were, respected as people with agency, with a choice, and they could understand what was happening with they and themselves and their data. And that's why their code of research, respect, honesty, justice and fairness, care and process, treats the subject as a partner, as an equal, and not as someone for something to be done to. So I think in the future, those will be the best practices.
George, thank you very much. Some really fantastic points in there. So we appreciate it very much. I'd also like to introduce Dr. Rachele Berria as well now. Rachele, thank you so much for joining us today. If okay with you, I'd like to go to a next question to get your input on. And this question is as follows. How would you describe what an industry good governance platform in using advanced technologies might look like? Rachele, welcome and thank you.
Thank you, Ted, for inviting me. So I think the industry governance should stem from a careful consideration of really all the challenges, not only the opportunities that digital health brings to the key actors in the ecosystem, the patients and the clinicians. And if I think about a few, looking at the patients, are we infrastructure ready? Just 1 or 2 years ago, I was at a conference. I'm going to share with you this story. And there is a person presenting some data on the diabetes prevention program in Kentucky and saying how difficult it has been to bring patients to the clinic. And so at the end of her talk, I stood up and I asked a question and I said, well, do you know that all these programs are actually now given in a digital format, and it would make it so much easier for patients? And she almost laughed at me and she said, you know that in vast areas of Kentucky, we don't have broadband internet. And so that was that touch of reality that really gave me pause. So that's one. The other piece clearly is a simple question. Are patients sufficiently savvy in digital? Or we're introducing yet another bias in creating all these tools for the benefit of those that are the most motivated, that have the higher education or socioeconomic status, neglecting those that in fact need them the most. And the other critical ethical piece that I can think of, especially in the US, is are health insurers and employers ready to really make a pledge not to misuse the information on pre-existing medical condition or presence of risk factors when it comes to granting health coverage or even hiring a person for a job. Now, if I think about the clinicians, there's all sort of other issues. One of them, for example, could be, are we ready to accept a little bit of the black box that is represented by the AI-driven observation? For example, last year, we had results from retinal scans that actually were over 99% correct in assigning the gender of the patient, when the human eye, very trained, medically trained human eye, has only 50-50 chance. Now, we don't know how that algorithm works, but it works. So are we ready to accept that as clinicians, me first? Another key challenge for clinicians is, are we ready not to passively over-rely on technology and to be really able and willing to critically appraise that? Another example is that I would like to quote is a study done in over 14,000 hospitalized patients fairly recently, showing that those with pneumonia and asthma had lower death rates than those with pneumonia alone. So in essence, you would think that asthma acted almost like as a protective variable, which of course, clinically makes no sense. And here I think is where Dr. Google gives us an information that still requires the clinical training and the clinical sense of a healthcare professional to apply that critical thinking. So of course, patients with underlying asthma who develop pneumonia are more likely to get earlier care, better care, and to be admitted early to the intensive care unit, which would then result in lesser deaths than those with pneumonia. The other key challenge for clinicians is, are we ready to start using solutions with little evidence? And so this is the paradox of digital health, right? With no evidence, there's no implementation, but then with no implementation, how can you generate the evidence? So I think the good set of principles to answer your question for informing good governance for industry, and this is maybe in random order of importance, is around, I think, 5 concepts. We should be open to innovation, but not being blindsided by the bright and shiny objects, really minimizing all the potential challenges. And that's why I put those up front in answering your question. Second, we should be starting with the patient in mind as the owners of their disease and really work and means to improve their self-efficacy and their digital literacy. We should be committed to new ways, agile ways to conduct validation clinical trials, because the data really moves so fast that the classic randomized clinical trials will be obsolete by the time we get the results. And so we should be doing those pragmatically in the real world without sacrificing the scientific rigor of that. And as Jessica was mentioning, and really all the other esteemed colleagues of mine here in this panel, including all races and ethnicities, the gender and age group that truly represents America. I heard the other day the new president-elect saying, my picks for the cabinets will represent true America. And it's the same for our clinical trials that will inform key decisions. We should be transparent in sharing those results. This is critical, and being equally prone to submit every kind of results for publication, including the neutral results and the negative results. I would add, it would be great if also the scientific editors of key journals will be equally inclined to accept those papers for publication, because there's a bias to really give privileged access to those that have new, positive, and exciting results. And maybe the last one is the most important one. We should be operating in a consortium as part of a really big and complex ecosystem where the collective contribution counts more than the sum of the single parts. And this is something that I truly wholeheartedly believe in, Ted.
Rachele, thank you so much for those valuable insights and also for highlighting those points. Really great input there. So thank you so much. And Jessica, if I could go back to you and ask you to come back to camera as well. I'd like to get your input on the same question that we just got from Rachele. And again, that question was, how would you describe what an industry good governance platform in using advanced technologies might look like? Jessica, thank you.
Rachele gave a very good and comprehensive overview, and I will just emphasize a few of the points. On transparency, the Bioethics International report is a really good place to start. They do a report ranking all of the pharma companies based on exactly, are they sharing the data? How are they publishing the information? There's also a concept that is a little different than the typical transparency, but it's the shared standards. And a good governance platform, I think, needs some level of standardization, because we don't want to fall into a trap where there's an industry good governance for Africa and an industry good governance for Europe and for North America and for Latin America or for Asia. We need an industry good governance that is global, because that's what's going to actually enable the most equitable and fair approach to using technology to improve clinical trials. I think there's also a piece here which we've been seeing advanced a lot by the EU and US and a little bit in China, is using real world data for regulatory approvals to either complement or replace, in some places, RCTs. And this is an interesting one, because on the one hand, you have very strong advocates for RCTs, for very good reasons. They generate data that is just, we can't get elsewhere. But then on the other hand, you also have some very vocal advocates for using real world data for additional indications or to supplement the regulatory process. And some of the newer discussions are around, what is the ethical obligation to get medicines to patients faster, to enable them to some level choose the level of risk that they're wanting to take for some of these additional indications from real world evidence. And even pushing the real world evidence discussion even further, Raquel mentioned, synthetic control arms and using data in different ways to enable faster research. And this is particularly the case in early research and early development, and replacing your traditional toxicology studies and in replacing some of the early clinical studies. We can actually use data and modeling in an appropriate way to expedite the research. And some of these industry-wide good governance platforms are going to need to be accelerated by industry associations, by coalitions, by cooperations, like Rachele mentioned, because it's not going to be enough for one company or one geography to make that change. It is going to need to be all of us coming together. And even if it's not perfect, we can't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. We need to move forward with some industry good governance standards across our whole world in life sciences to help us advance a more equitable approach to digital innovation in clinical research.
Jessica, thank you. Really valuable and exciting, input there. So thank you so much for that. And Sri, if I could go back to you on this question as well, would love to get your input just with your technology background, digital data, AI background. Same question to you. How would you describe what an industry good governance platform and using advanced technologies might look like? Sri, thank you.
No, thank you so much. As all my esteemed colleagues have talked about, the critical component here is to make patients, sites, and sponsors to work in a very cohesive and integrated manner. So let's look at the full continuum of recruitment all the way to submission. As everybody have said, from a recruitment standpoint, having that diversity and inclusion criteria, very critical. Really, I think several sponsors are really looking at the mix of who are being recruited into the trial. There are a lot of technology interventions to identify the right sites, the right type of patient population to go and get them, but also to motivate them to participate in the trial, component one. Once the patients are recruited or wanting to be selected, how do you enable them in that process to work in a cohesive and cogent manner using digital health? 2 years back, as my colleagues talked about, the example was when you talked about digital health, people said, are you really going bleeding edge? COVID and other things have really accelerated the adoption of digital health and digital health in the hands of our patients. So that has really encouraged best practices on putting digital health and digital health technology in the hands of people. Now, you need different models for enabling digital health. One, for different economic backgrounds to provide them all the kit, whether it's the cell phone, the connected devices, the biometrics, and all of that. For others, you bring your own device who don't want to be bringing in and burdened by providing the technology. So as you start to build and collect information, you need to have multiple enabling models to collect and bring that information together. Okay, now that you start to bring the information together, how do you use the information? That goes into transparency. Patients want to know, what are they doing? What are we doing with the data? How do you use it? What does it mean to benefit them? And so really building that thing about transparency, helping them to build the trust and trustworthiness, very critical component of it. Now, as you bring all of that together, diversity and inclusion, the frameworks that support them, the collection of digital data, then you go back to best practices around, okay, what do I do with it? How do I make this thing a better good for society at large? How do we really bring and use these things to augment the making of decisions through the clinical trial process? So I really like the word of humans. A lot of my colleagues here talked in the panel about how do you make the human and the technology work? So rather than we call it artificial intelligence, we need to be bringing in augmented intelligence. It augments the sites to recruit better, augments the patients to engage better, augments the sponsors to really look at information and then adapt and be agile and react better. And so as you start to build this type of technology framework of bringing information, making it consumable, making it transparent, but augmenting the team and structure, that gives you really a sense of how you could bring a cohesive framework for making digital and digital transformation and digital health transformation work well. And last, as you start to build all of these things, you really need a technology to support you. And I'm not trying to say, as you start to build algorithms, you need a technology or algorithm to see if we are introducing bias. As you start to get outcomes, you need to be looking across the model to making sure that things what you thought would happen are happening or not happening. And so constantly we need to have a technology which is being built, but also technology which will then be assessing whether what we're doing is correct, of course, with the supervision of the human. And that's very critical because we're not building Terminators, we're actually building Iron Man, augmented intelligence. And so as you start to build that together in that augmented way, you could really enable transformation to happen.
Sri, thank you so much for that input and really going into detail there. Just a few questions come in. Again, Jessica, if I could go to you really quickly. If you can answer this or if you can point this in the right direction. There was a question that came in for you on what is the exact name of the bioethics report that you had mentioned when you were discussing. Thank you, Jessica.
Yeah, great question. If you Google Scientific American and Bioethics International, you'll find it. They put out together with Scientific American, they put out a really big special report. And there's about 10 wonderful articles that go into the topics we're discussing today, as well as that transparency report for the different pharma companies with the rankings included.
Thank you so much, Jessica. Appreciate that. And then one more question on that topic that came in as well for Jessica, Rachele, or Sri, if you want to answer this. And what you discussed in regard to that question, would this allow for more consistency in study designs? Would this promote standardization study protocols that can be easily adapted to each unique situation?
Yeah, I could start, but I can let Jessica and Rachele add to it. I think it will. I think a critical component of it is how do you enable standardization? But standardization may not be across all therapeutic areas, but standardization would be very one about depending on the therapeutic area, whether I'm in a rare disease or a vaccine or an oncology, how do I bring in device data and protocol standardization? I'd love to let Jessica and others contribute to that.
There's a great quote that I love from Albert Einstein. It says, everything should be made as simple as possible, but not simpler. And I think, it does apply also to this concept. There has to be a set of standard criteria for these trials that really applies all across the board, that we want to make sure we're not losing those differences that make that patient group, that ethnicity really unique, and respect that. And in fact, that's the whole point of including all different age groups, genders, and ethnicities in the clinical trials in such a way that we will be able to draw conclusions that work for each and every one of those participants, yet can highlight highlight potential differences in treatment response or whatnot. So that would be my answer. But I'm looking forward to Jessica, that I know is there ready to answer.
Oh, you've got two good answers there. I know my colleagues in regulatory will talk about their years of experience in pushing towards regulatory harmonization to get us closer to those standardized study design protocols across the world. Yes, the answer is yes, technology can support that, but technology isn't the leader here. We're usually enabling what the regulators or the sponsors need to deliver. What technology can do is make that a little faster, and have modular builds. You know, Huma is deployed across decentralized clinical trials, and the way you can quickly and rapidly pick the modules you want, pick the sensors you want to use, upload the questionnaires or the prompts, and you can have it deployed very quickly, which helps, but the actual design and the protocol still remains with the sponsors, and to a large extent has to do with the regulator input as well.
Ted, do you mind if I jump in? I know you didn't ask for a fourth.
Please do. Thank you.
I do want to point out the fact that unlike past technologies that, you know, IVR or whatnot, where people were having to do this manually, digital technologies do give us opportunity to redesign what a clinical trial can look like, right? Where before it was, you know, let's use a typical drug. You have your 3 phases, and then you've got your phase 4 pharmacovigilance to monitor in the field, which kind of, unless there's a bad result, you don't really hear about it. Digital technologies allow us to, as Jessica was was saying, speed up the process. And you're seeing it now with, we could talk about COVID-19, or we could talk about other drugs and devices in development, where we can make the development process more real time. And this goes more to how the Institute of Medicine was trying to build a real-time healthcare learning system, right? Where the system is learning as it goes in an iterative manner, using real-time data to educate itself and all the constituents, patients, physicians, providers, payers, everyone, so that we can actually give the best care possible, not wait several years down the line to find out the results.
Great input, George, and thank you all of you for answering that. It was fantastic input on that. George, if I could stay with you, I want to move to our next topic question as well too. The question is, what should be done to narrow the current digital divide to secure better health parity between the industrialized and developing world from an ethics perspective? Dr. Mathew, thank you.
My focus has always been mostly on data privacy and the value of the data. As we know, and you know, Jessica's heard me talk about this before, so apologies for the redundancy, Jessica. You know, data is used in multiple ways by many healthcare companies and incumbents. What we're realizing now is that that data has value, it has weight. You know, the World Economic Forum declared data as an asset back in 2011 or 12. In healthcare and life sciences, that data is still seen as the purview of only healthcare professionals. What we do realize now, though, is that as we go globally and start gathering that data, you know, people are more aware of what's happening with their data. You know, it's not just Cambridge Analytica and realizing that someone's broken in and taken your data. It's being used and reused in ways that are making large companies money. And as we look at how some of these therapies are priced, especially in the United States, but even globally, it's at a point where there is a disconnect between what data is taken, how it's being used, how it's being put out back in terms of a product or service, and how that's, you know, that access or that lack of access is making people question whether they actually want to share their data. I think we need to go through and realize that, you know, again, going to some of these other countries that are developing, these folks have agency, they have a choice, and, you know, it's their data we need to start using, but we need to treat them as someone who has a choice, who has the ability to decide if they want to participate or not. I think there's always been an almost, as I said before, a paternalistic view of, well, it's for the good of humanity, so you have to give us your data because we're going to discover a drug that'll save a lot of people. But, you know, in this day and age, in 2020, almost 2021, many people, especially now during the pandemic, especially during an economic crisis, come back to, well, how is this going to help me and my family? And there hasn't been a good answer given because it's never been forced before. I believe these digital technologies will start forcing that. And, you know, I think it'll be important for the incumbents to figure out not only a way to do this, but possibly even redesign their business models to be inclusive, to actually account for having to compensate over a period of time. It's not an Amazon gift card for $50 and I never see you again. Maybe it's an equity model. Maybe it's a annuity model. Maybe it's a way they can invest their data within the company so that as that product goes and gets commercialized, these folks get access to a drug or a device they would normally not get, or they get to grow, you know, it's their choice. That has to be figured out, I believe, because otherwise, as we're seeing with COVID-19 now, when we need folks for things like public health with contact tracing and sharing their data, what we're seeing quite often are people just refusing to participate because they don't trust what's happening with their data. And if we can't do it for a public health emergency, how are we going to do it for clinical trials?
Sure. George, thank you so much for that input. And before I move on and get a few of the other panelists' input on this, George, we did have a question going back to something you had mentioned earlier. Someone in our audience asked if you could elaborate on the code of research you mentioned. They weren't clear if you were referring to a particular item or to the general medical research codes. Thank you, George.
Sure, and I'm going to refer to the set of articles I believe that Jessica Federer gave a link for. One of the articles that was mentioned was something called the SAN Code of Research. It has to do, it's SAN Code of Research. I can try to find the link and put it into the chat so that folks can take a look at it. In a nutshell, there was an African tribe that was, they requested to use some of their data to do some research. And what was found was the researchers, instead of treating them with respect or as equals, treated them like lab experimental animals. They took pictures of them in states of undress. They took their data, took it to another continent and didn't share the data or the results back with the scientists, with the tribe. And I think there was just an assumption that they wouldn't understand or wouldn't know. I'm not sure. But the tribe then worked with some consultants and then developed what they believed to be an ethical code of research, which, you know, quite honestly, I have a son in 3rd grade. These are the same similar rules they use for kids to deal with other kids: showing respect, showing transparency, honesty, justice, and fairness. These are things that we sometimes take for granted, but the fact we have to explicitly say it, I think, is more of a reminder to show that we have to show this as we go forward in clinical research.
George, thank you so much for that. Jessica, thank you again for sending around those articles to this group, prior to this meeting today as well too. Rachele, if I could go to you again for the same question I asked George previously. Again, that question was, what should be done to narrow the current digital divide to secure better health parity between the industrialized and developing world from an ethics perspective? Rachele, thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Ted. I think the question that you're asking highlights the concept of equity versus equality. And some people use them interchangeably, but they're not. So with equality, we give everyone the same opportunity. With equity, we look at the differences of what baseline are people starting from, what kind of healthcare those patients have. And so a very simple example to explain this is, if we have 3 kids that are trying to watch a game through a tall fence, and we give all the 3 of them the same stool, the short one, I'm vertically challenged, so I feel that this example really speaks to me, will still not be able to watch the game. And so the same concept applies with patients. We need to meet them where they are, finding out what is different in their journey of their disease, and use really digital technology to make things simple for them. There's the myth that technology is difficult. I really do believe that it's quite the opposite. Technology is meant to make things simple. Now, at AstraZeneca, we also made a conscious decision to focus on the younger generation. because we do believe that they bring health and digital literacy to their family, and they will build their, their future society. And so we started in 2010. So at this point, we have 10 years of experience, a global program which is called Young Health Program. And this really looks at the non-communicable disease prevention in young people aged 10 to 24 to take control of their health, especially to combat long-term conditions such as cancer, diabetes, respiratory and heart disease, and mental health. Our aim, we have a very lofty goal, is to reduce the uptake of this unhealthy behavior. In fact, reducing it by a third in the near future. And we're already active in 20 countries in the world. And in fact, a lot of these countries are in South Africa and Latin America. So this is something that I'm really proud of. We did surpass early during the year in 2020 our target and set a new one to reach 5 million young people by 2025 being impacted and educated by this program. And we renewed our commitment with additional $35 million and added a key partner, which is UNICEF, to the equation. And so we really want to reduce premature deaths linked to this non-communicable disease by 1/3 by 2030 and promote their well-being. So I really feel like focusing on the younger generation will help diminishing this digital divide that you asked about, Ted.
Thank you so much, Rachele. I really appreciate your response. And Jessica, love just to even get a little bit more comment from you on this topic as well again. And again, what should be done to narrow the current digital divide to secure better health parity between the industrialized and developing world from an ethics perspective? Thank you, Jessica.
And such good answers from these wonderful colleagues. I would start with two things: infrastructure and innovation. The digital divide is going to continue to be there until countries have the infrastructure to enable their people to overcome it. So I was part of the ITU Empowering Development Group of the United Nations. The ITU is the International Telecommunications Union. For those of you on this call that are interested in supporting infrastructure investment and change, I encourage you to reach out to the ITU. They have a lot of workshops and working groups where you can be part of some of these infrastructure investments and changes. And so, first you need that infrastructure piece, and that's big and that's expensive and that takes collaboration, and we need groups like the UN and the Galleon Foundation and international organizations to convene us and to continue pulling us forward to get those infrastructure investments. The second piece is innovation. The digital divide exists because some phones cost a whole lot more and Wi-Fi networks cost a whole lot more, and there's this innovation divide where if we can get the cost of chips and phones and actually the solutions down, if we continue innovating to improve our digital solutions and reduce the costs and reduce the burden and increase the battery life, then instead of sending around devices that need Bluetooth connections that are taking energy, which there aren't a lot of energy sources. If you go out to Mongolia and you're charging from the solar panel on the GUR, you don't have so many options for what it is you're prioritizing to charge. But if we keep innovating, one of the things that our company Huma has been really successful in deploying to increase equitable access is actually putting the algorithms in the phone. So you put your finger on the camera to get heart rate and heart rate variability. You put the phone on your chest and breathe, and the movement gives you the breath rate. And there's so much more that you can collect from the sensors in a phone that can be validated and used in a study or used actually in clinical care. We have virtual COVID-19 wards deployed all across Germany and the UK using very simple technology on the phone that everyone has. And so with a combination of innovation and continuing to be relentless in our pursuit of saying, what can we build and do that's clinically meaningful that everyone can access that has a little Android phone anywhere in the world? And then also looking at what is that bigger picture, longer term infrastructure investment that must start 10 years ago to be ready. How do you make those stable infrastructure investments? Those two things I think will make a huge difference in narrowing that digital divide which is such it's actually, I think, something that frustrates all of us that work in healthcare, that in 2020, we're talking about a digital divide that's separating haves from have-nots, when the tech should be the thing that eliminates the divide and gives everyone that equal access.
Thank you so much, Jessica. Really valuable points, and really appreciate you bringing those up. And to our whole panelists, thank you for all your input today. It's been such a valuable discussion. I appreciate you going through my questions and giving some really great input and your knowledge with our entire audience today. But before I let you go, I have to bring up one topic, and I really would love to get all of your input on this. I think this is a topic that unfortunately is on everyone's mind over the last year. And the topic deals with, of course, of a lot of discussion around the COVID-19 vaccine, right? And the proposed distribution of the vaccine. Would love to get your input, and if you could please provide us with your thoughts on this topic. I think it would be really valuable input for our audience. And Rachele, I think you're a fantastic person to start this discussion. If I could pass to you first on this question. Thank you.
Thank you, Ted. Yeah, you're right. It's front and center in everybody's mind, clearly. So I think COVID-19 is first and foremost a huge humanitarian challenge. And what we started doing since the very beginning of this pandemic was focusing on key partnerships with the scientists, Oxford University, Nashville University, with the governments, and with the international organizations and local manufacturers to establish agreements for the development and the supply and distribution, like you said, of the vaccine should it prove effective and well tolerated. There's three pieces that we kept in mind since the beginning. First and foremost, the cost. And so we thought that a pandemic is not the right time to make any profit. So we committed throughout the pandemic to provide the vaccine at cost. Second of all, and I think this applies particularly to meet low-income countries, the storage. And so we believe that the fact that the AstraZeneca vaccine that we're working on with the University of Oxford can be stored, transported, and handled at normal refrigerated conditions, that would be a temperature point between 2 and 4 degrees Celsius for at least 6 months, with the opportunity of providing it within the existing healthcare setting will help a lot. And then the third key point is that we secure landmark agreements with key coalitions like the Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness Innovation, the Gavi Vaccine Alliance to support the manufacturing. This will help us really reach that commitment that we gave to distribute 300 million doses of the vaccine. And we're also teaching really the local communities how to manufacture that in a way that it will be really simplified. As the CEO of AstraZeneca, Pascal Soriot, always says, we don't have to fight against each other. We need as many vaccines as possible. We need to fight the virus. So that would be my 2 cents on this.
Rachele, really valuable. And thank you for providing that to us. Sri, if I could go to you next and get your info on this important topic again around the COVID-19 vaccine, the proposed distribution of the vaccine, just to get your thoughts on this topic. Thank you.
This is by far the most important problem statement for all of us, and it goes to I would say in 2 parts. One is, how do you accelerate vaccine, through the regulatory process, and second is, once you have that, how do you then distribute it much more? As you start to really look at acceleration of the vaccine regulatory process, there's a strong emphasis on diversity and inclusion, really looking at, are we having the right segments, ethnic segments, as well as segments around age and others, so that we can make sure that when the vaccine comes out, it's being well tested across all these different diversity and inclusion groups, so that when we are now distributing en masse, we have the statistical and the regulatory progress that this is the right thing and that it can be used to scale. So that's the first part of it. I think there's a lot of emphasis around recruitment and selection and making sure that those populations of folks are coming together. I think the second part of that same COVID stuff is around how do you then quickly collect information from all of them. That's where digital and digital health is becoming a very important part, as Jessica talked about, the whole notion of decentralized trials. George talked about digital health devices and others are all now becoming part of that acceleration, because without that, I don't think we could do what we can do today in such a fast and accelerated manner. The third is, now that you got it through the regulatory approval, how do you quickly then get it through multiple country regulatory approval? We know UK is already approved. There are several organizations going on. FDA is going through the process. So really, how do you bring and collect and collate data correctly? Because that's a very critical component of really accelerating the regulatory approval process. Now that you've got the vaccine approved, there comes what Rachele talked about, the distribution of this across multiple different segments. As you know, we have in the US put together a high level model around who's going to get it first and next, but we all know, given different societies and structure, or does it all go to the right people at the right time at the most equitable manner? And I think that truly requires the right type of governance and I would say oversight, but humanitarian oversight, to make sure that the haves and the have-nots get equitable distribution, going back to the model which Rachele talked about. So I think it's a multi-tiered process, getting the right patients, getting them the right data, accelerating that, and then distributing that in a fair and equitable manner. So we're really in very accelerated times in making this thing happen. And so we're working with several partners on this call and others to make this thing happen. So thank you.
Sri, thank you so much for your input. And George and Jessica, I know we're running out of time, but I really want to get your input on this question as well, too, if I can, the last few moments here. So again, a lot of discussion around COVID-19 vaccine, the proposed distribution of vaccine. Could you provide us with your thoughts on this topic? George, if we can start with you quickly, and then we'll go to Jessica. Thank you.
I'm going to emphasize the human aspect of it. Look, we've got at least 3 candidates, if not more, that are on the dock to kind of start going out there, and they have different requirements, whether it's freezing, the amount of time it takes to transport it, the logistics that are involved with it, some of the digital tracking that'll be involved with it. That's all good, and it's going to be complex, especially with the political aspect that's been thrown into the arena as well. But what seems to be coming up time and time again is having people actively participating and working together to make this happen. Somebody, I think actually somebody on one of the on the Biden task force mentioned the difference between having a vaccine and actual vaccination. It's great that we have a vaccine, but until it gets in the arm twice within the period amount of time, we don't have immunity. And come to think of it, in interviews with the I think it was the Pfizer CEO that had pointed out that there's no guarantee that even with the vaccine that it will not spread. We have to recognize that this is a real-time experiment going on right now. But because of that, to win people's trust, we need to be fully transparent as to what's going on, how they're participating, and allow them the opportunity to not only communicate their concerns, but if they opt to decide against doing something, we have to take the time to try to understand it. I was on a call with global CMOs about how to distribute the vaccine amongst our employees. For our company, we have 136 employees in 73 countries. This is a little bit of a challenge for us too. And though companies are seen as communities, the issue that came out is, though in some places we may legally be able to mandate vaccine use, it's probably a better idea not to, only because we may actually cause more resistance to taking the vaccine than we would otherwise. We have to respect other people's opinions and figure out a way to influence it. It's the high tech, high touch. Without one, we can't have the other.
George, fantastic input. And Jessica, in our last moments here, would love your input as well, too. Thank you.
You know, George's thoughts made me think of a video that a friend of mine sent. She just lost her partner to COVID. And she sent this video from YouTube called Hindsight is 2020. And, you know, in it, it's about all the horrible things that have happened this year. But in looking in hindsight at 2020, the things that came out of it. And, you know, for someone who just lost COVID to be sending that was a really strong message for me. And I think if I could say what's coming out of COVID here and what we have an opportunity to do is use this opportunity to get rid of the divide between pharma and our volunteers, and to really come together as partners and change the future of research, because now everyone that comes to the table is a partner in our research, and we have a long-term relationship with them, a two-way exchange of information, where now we have relationships with all the people that have touched our products, and they're going to continue to, if we do this well and we hold their trust well and we earn their trust continually, they're going to share data with us as they progress through their life, as they progress through chronic conditions, as they progress through different stages. And this horrible catalyst, this unwanted catalyst of COVID-19 could be a turning point that changes the way volunteers and clinical trials and sponsors and CROs, it could change the way we work. Instead of being a transactional arrangement, to being an actual community that advances us towards that learning healthcare system that is the holy grail for so many of us.
Jessica, thank you so much for that valuable input. And unfortunately with that, we are out of time today. So first off, a big thank you to our panelists for sharing their thought-provoking insights, and to the audience for participating in this stimulating discussion. Rachele, Jessica, Sri, George, it was absolutely my honor and pleasure to spend the last 60 minutes with you guys. You were fantastic, and really appreciate all that you do for healthcare, for the patients that ultimately benefit, and for all of your insights to our audience today. So thank you so much. And to our audience, we look forward to your participation in future events, including the sessions in the car later this week. With that, have a great rest of the week, and thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.